this thing about protein and whether or not somebody's over consuming protein is interesting, because there are reasons to have high levels of protein, depending on what we're trying to do. Now, normally we're not just trying to, peak leucine thresholds. We're not just trying to maximize muscle hypertrophy. We're also trying to hit other things like the satiating benefits of protein. And one way or other, we want our athletes, our clients, our whoever, to be maybe eating more of certain kinds of foods and less of others. And that's where protein can have its uses. Sure. One of the pitfalls, though, that I find, particularly with the types of athletes that I work with, when they're trying to eat a lot more protein, they are going down the convenience path. Right. Because eating that much chicken, that much beef, that much plant-based, food-based protein sources can be a real challenge. Yeah. So then they really get into the sort of the more processed forms of protein, your powders and your bars. And in there, a bit like a Trojan horse, there's other things inside these things typically that they don't realize because they're not as good at reading labels or whatever. So they end up with all their carbohydrates and sugars and all that other stuff. Not that carbohydrates and sugars are different things, but you know what I mean? So that's why I'm asking you about this piece about, is there too much? What's the consequences of consuming too much? And I guess the big worry, particularly I've heard from some of my youth athletes, their parents will come and say, oh, but it's, my GP, my doctor, the family doctor said that protein's bad for you. Right. What's going on there? Why are people worried about excess protein? You already mentioned the toxic word, but what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, toxic from the standpoint that biological systems just want to get rid of nitrogen. Free nitrogen doesn't exist in biology. It exists as an ammonium ion, and that alters pH. And so, let's push the toxic part aside and say that the three horsemen of the protein apocalypse are: first, protein changes your blood pH and it causes your bones to be weaker. It leaches calcium from your bones. So that's categorically incorrect. And so just to set the record straight here, three nutrients matter for bone. And primary, number one and number two, are calcium and vitamin on your side of the Atlantic, D. And then protein is number three. When you've dialed in calcium and you've dialed in vitamin D, then protein is a bone supportive nutrient. The observation was you ate more protein, you excreted more excreted more calcium in your urine. And that's as a result of because you absorb more calcium from your gastrointestinal tract. So that theory, it used to be called the acid ash hypothesis, is categorically incorrect. Number two, that's an older one. Number two would be protein, in quotation, my air quotes, causes kidney damage or failure. It's called the Brenner hypothesis. It's been around for 60 years now. And the WHO and the Institute of Medicine in North America agree that there is no relationship between dietary protein and progressive decline in kidney function with age. I'm not making that up. You read the Beyond the RDA paper, so I quote them directly there, and they agree. And so those are some pretty learned people. We've done meta-analyses on this, so have lots of other groups, and 60 years later, we're still looking for the evidence that causality that's implied is there, and we can't find it. So everybody said, well, absence of evidence isn't, and I'm like, okay, but it's been 60 years, maybe the hypothesis isn't right, just to be clear. And so that's where we're at on that one. I think most people now are thinking there's no causality. If you have chronic kidney disease, protein restriction, probably a good idea because you're trying to preserve kidney function, but not for athletes and mere mortals. The last one is protein these days causes rises in things like IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor. It promotes cancer. It can trigger rises in mTOR activation that lead to cardiovascular disease. And, from that standpoint, there's a lot of other nutrients that I would pick on before protein as a causative agent in both of those diseases. And if you stay tuned, and if we ever get this published, we've got some data that shows that when you look at big samples, food record type data, because there's no controlled trials on this, obviously, but observational data, that there's no association between protein intake and cancer or cardiovascular disease. There's association between protein foods. So, the one that most people can put their finger on is like red meat, for example, and colon cancer. But that's not a protein question. And in fact, if you look at all of the data that's out there, plant protein, if that's, the bent, it's pretty important these days, is actually not associated with any adverse health outcomes. So it can't be protein per se, probably more the foods that contain protein. So that's generally the GP-based advice, although I think most people hang it on the kidney, causes kidney damage, kidney failure. And there's just no data. So most people now are coming around to maybe Brenner wasn't quite there.